Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of breaking glass. Someone is robbing your neighbor's home. You rush to your window and look outside, but there's no one to call. No police dispatcher. No patrol cars with flashing lights racing to the scene. No trained officers to handle the situation. In fact, the very concept of a police force doesn't even exist yet. So what do you do? Who protects you and your community when crime strikes in the dead of night? This was the reality for tens of thousands of Americans living in colonial towns and early American settlements throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and well into the 1800s. Before the establishment of professional police departments, ordinary citizens were responsible for their own safety and the enforcement of law and order. The systems they created were chaotic, often brutal, and deeply rooted in community participation. Yet these systems laid the groundwork for modern American law enforcement. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating and often overlooked world of how early American towns dealt with crime before police. From the town watch system to vigilante justice, from constables to night patrols, this is a story of survival, community, and the wild, uncertain quest for justice in a land without badges. Historical context and background. To understand how early American towns handled crime, we must first understand the world they inhabited. Colonial America, spanning roughly from the early 1600s through the late 1700s, was a collection of settlements scattered along the eastern seaboard, isolated by vast wilderness and connected only by rudimentary roads and waterways. These communities were small, often numbering only a few hundred residents, and were largely self-sufficient. The concept of centralized government was weak, and the reach of British colonial authorities was limited, especially in rural areas. In this environment, the English common law tradition heavily influenced how colonists approached justice and law enforcement. The settlers brought with them centuries-old practices from England, including the system of hue and cry, where citizens were expected to raise an alarm and pursue criminals, and the role of the constable, an appointed official responsible for maintaining order. However, the vast distances, sparse populations, and lack of resources meant these systems had to be adapted, and often improvised, to fit the harsh realities of the New World. During the colonial period, there was no concept of a professional, paid police force. Law enforcement was considered a civic duty, not a career. Towns operated on the principle of collective responsibility, where every able-bodied man was expected to contribute to the safety and order of the community. This expectation was formalized through various institutions, the most prominent being the town watch. The town watch was a rotating system of nighttime patrols, where male citizens took turns walking the streets, watching for fires, disturbances, and criminal activity. Participation was mandatory in many towns, and failure to serve could result in fines or other penalties. The watch was supplemented by constables, part-time officials elected or appointed to serve for a year at a time. Constables had limited powers. They could arrest criminals, serve warrants, and keep the peace, but they had no formal training, no uniforms, and often no compensation beyond modest fees for specific services. Beyond these formal systems, early Americans also relied heavily on informal social controls. In small, tight-knit communities, reputation mattered immensely. Public shame, ostracism, and community pressure were powerful deterrents against wrongdoing. Physical punishments, such as whipping, time in the stocks, or branding, were common and served as public spectacles designed to humiliate offenders and discourage others from breaking the law. By the time of the American Revolution and the early years of the United States, cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were growing rapidly, bringing new challenges. Urban crime increased, and the old systems of constables and town watches proved inadequate. Yet it would take decades, well into the mid-1800s, before the first professional police departments were established, modeled after London's Metropolitan Police Force, founded in 1829. Understanding this context is essential because it reveals a fundamental truth. Early America was a society that valued self-reliance and community participation over centralized authority. Law enforcement was not the responsibility of a distant government. It was the responsibility of every citizen. This ethos shaped not only how towns dealt with crime, but also how Americans came to view justice, authority, and their role in maintaining order. Case studies/real-life examples. The Town Watch in Boston, a nightly vigil. Boston, one of the largest and most important colonial cities, provides an excellent case study of how the Town Watch system functioned in practice. Established in the 1630s, Boston's watch was one of the earliest in the colonies. Every evening at 9 o'clock, a bell would ring, signaling the start of the watch. Men designated for duty that night would report to a central location, receive their assignments, and then fan out across the town to patrol the streets until dawn. The duties of the watch were varied and demanding. Watchmen were expected to look out for fires, a constant and deadly threat in towns built primarily of wood. They were to apprehend suspicious persons, break up fights, and ensure that taverns closed at the appointed hour. They carried lanterns, rattles to sound alarms, and sometimes crude weapons like staffs or cudgels. However, the system was far from perfect. Many men resented the duty, viewing it as a burden that took them away from their families and livelihoods. Wealthy citizens often paid fines to avoid serving, or hired substitutes, usually poor men or recent immigrants, to take their place. This created a watch composed largely of individuals who lacked motivation, training, or community ties, leading to inefficiency and corruption. Records from the 1730s reveal numerous complaints about watchmen sleeping on duty, arriving late, or being drunk. In 1735, the Boston Town Meeting passed stricter regulations, imposing fines and threatening jail time for negligent watchmen. Yet enforcement remained inconsistent. The watch was a civic duty, not a professional service, and the town had limited means to ensure compliance. Despite its flaws, the watch did provide a degree of security. In 1741, a series of arsons terrorized Boston. Watchmen working closely with constables and citizens managed to apprehend a suspect who was subsequently tried and executed. The swift response demonstrated that, when functioning properly, the watch could be effective, but it required community cooperation and vigilance. The Constable's Dilemma, Crime in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, founded by William Penn in 1682, offers another instructive example. Penn envisioned a holy experiment, a city governed by Quaker principles of peace, tolerance, and community. Yet even in this idealistic setting, crime was a persistent problem. Constables in Philadelphia held a unique position. Elected annually by their wards, they were expected to enforce laws, collect taxes, and maintain order, all while continuing their regular occupations. Most constables were tradesmen or shopkeepers with no legal training. Their authority derived not from professional expertise, but from their standing in the community. In 1750, Constable William Bradford faced a crisis. A gang of thieves had been operating along the Delaware River waterfront, stealing cargo from ships and warehouses. Bradford, a printer by trade, had neither the time nor the resources to mount a proper investigation. He turned to the community, organizing a group of merchants and dockworkers to patrol the waterfront at night. Within weeks, the volunteers apprehended 3 suspects, who were brought before a magistrate, tried, and sentenced to public whipping and branding. This case illustrates both the strengths and weaknesses of the constable system. Bradford's success depended entirely on voluntary cooperation from citizens. Had the merchants refused to help, the thieves would have continued unchecked. The system worked, but only when the community was willing and able to mobilize. Yet the constable's power was limited. In 1755, Bradford encountered a more serious crime, a violent assault that left a man dead. The suspects were well-connected members of a prominent family. Despite clear evidence of guilt, Bradford found himself pressured by powerful citizens to drop the case. He persisted, but the suspects were ultimately acquitted by a sympathetic jury. The incident underscored a harsh reality. In a system reliant on community enforcement, justice was often influenced by wealth, status, and social connections. Vigilante justice in the backcountry, the regulator movement. While town watches and constables functioned reasonably well in coastal cities, the situation was far different on the frontier. In the Carolina backcountry during the 1760s, settlers lived in isolated homesteads, far from any centralized authority. Crime was rampant. Bandits, horse thieves, and gangs of outlaws preyed on farmers and travelers with little fear of consequences. The colonial government, centered in Charleston, was distant and indifferent to the plight of frontier settlers. Constables, if they existed at all, were few and far between. Courts met infrequently, and bringing a criminal to trial could take months or even years. Frustrated by the lack of protection, settlers took matters into their own hands. In 1767, a group calling themselves the Regulators formed in the South Carolina backcountry. These vigilantes organized patrols, hunted down suspected criminals, and administered their own brand of justice, often brutal and swift. Outlaws were whipped, branded, or driven out of the territory. In some cases, they were executed on the spot. The Regulators operated outside the law, yet they enjoyed widespread support from the settler population. To them, the Regulators were heroes, ordinary men who stepped up to protect their families and property when the government failed to do so. However, the movement was controversial. Critics argued that the Regulators were no better than the criminals they pursued, acting as judge, jury, and executioner without due process. In 1769, the colonial government finally responded, establishing courts and appointing sheriffs in the backcountry. The Regulators disbanded, but their legacy endured. The movement demonstrated both the strengths and dangers of community-based law enforcement. When formal systems failed, citizens could organize effective responses, but without legal oversight, justice easily became vengeance. The mob and public punishment. Salem, Massachusetts. In Salem, Massachusetts, during the late 1600s, crime and punishment were deeply intertwined with community spectacle. Public punishments were not merely about retribution. They were social events designed to reinforce moral order and deter wrongdoing. Consider the case of Mary Parsons, convicted of theft in 1692. Parsons, a servant, had stolen cloth from her employer. Her trial was swift, conducted by a local magistrate with testimony from witnesses. Found guilty, she was sentenced to be publicly whipped and placed in the stocks for 6 hours. On the appointed day, townspeople gathered in the square to watch the punishment. Parsons was stripped to the waist and whipped, 30 lashes, administered by the constable. Afterward, she was locked in the stocks, her head and hands immobilized, exposed to the jeers and insults of the crowd. Children threw rotten vegetables, adults mocked and condemned her. The punishment was brutal, humiliating, and intentionally public. It served multiple purposes: punishing the offender, deterring others, and reaffirming the community's shared values. Yet it also revealed the darker side of community-based justice. The crowd's cruelty could easily escalate into mob violence. In some cases, individuals targeted by public punishment were severely injured or even killed by enraged mobs. Salem's reliance on public punishment reflected a broader colonial practice. Without prisons, which were rare and expensive, communities relied on physical and psychological punishments that could be administered quickly and publicly. These spectacles reinforced social hierarchies and collective identity, but they also fostered a culture of shame and fear. Slave patrols in the South, a grim system of control. No discussion of early American law enforcement is complete without acknowledging the brutal system of slave patrols, particularly in the southern colonies. These patrols were organized groups of white men tasked with monitoring enslaved populations, preventing escapes, and suppressing any hint of rebellion. Slave patrols operated outside the bounds of what we might consider legitimate law enforcement. Patrollers had broad authority to stop, search, and punish enslaved people, often violently and without cause. They conducted nighttime raids, broke into slave quarters, and used intimidation and terror to maintain control. In South Carolina, slave patrols were formalized by law in 1704. Every white man was required to serve, and failure to participate could result in fines. Patrollers were empowered to whip, maim, or even kill enslaved individuals suspected of violations, with little to no legal accountability. These patrols were not about justice, they were about power and control. They represent a dark chapter in American history, one that complicates any discussion of early law enforcement. The systems that maintained order for some communities simultaneously enforced oppression and violence against others. Social impact and analysis. The systems of law enforcement in early America had profound social consequences, shaping the culture, values, and power dynamics of colonial and early American society. These impacts were complex, often contradictory, and deeply rooted in the social structures of the time. One of the most significant effects was the reinforcement of communal identity and collective responsibility. In towns where every man was expected to serve on the watch or support the constable, law enforcement became a shared endeavor. This fostered a sense of solidarity and mutual dependence. Citizens understood that their safety relied not on distant authorities, but on their neighbors. This created strong communal bonds, but also placed immense social pressure on individuals to conform to accepted norms. However, this system also entrenched social hierarchies. Wealthy and influential citizens could often avoid their duties by paying fines or hiring substitutes. This created a two-tiered system, where the burden of maintaining order fell disproportionately on the poor and working class. Moreover, those with wealth and connections could manipulate the justice system to their advantage, securing lenient treatment for themselves or their allies while ensuring harsh punishment for social outsiders. Public punishments, while effective as deterrents, cultivated a culture of shame and humiliation. They turned justice into spectacle, where the suffering of individuals became entertainment for the masses. This not only dehumanized offenders but also normalized violence and cruelty as acceptable responses to wrongdoing. The emotional intensity of these public events could easily escalate, leading to mob violence and extrajudicial killings. The reliance on community-based justice also meant that marginalized groups, immigrants, the poor, people of color, and women, were particularly vulnerable. Without formal legal protections or due process, accusations alone could result in severe punishment. The line between justice and persecution was often blurred, especially during periods of social anxiety or moral panic, as seen during events like the Salem witch trials. Furthermore, the absence of professional law enforcement meant that crime prevention was often reactive rather than proactive. Towns responded to crimes after they occurred, but lacked the resources or infrastructure to investigate complex cases or address underlying social problems that contributed to criminal behavior. In the South, the existence of slave patrols reveals the darkest aspect of these early systems. Law enforcement was not about universal justice, but about maintaining racial and social hierarchies. The violence and terror inflicted by slave patrols had lasting impacts, shaping both the lived experiences of enslaved people and the institutional frameworks that would later evolve into modern policing in the South. Modern connections, reflection. The systems of law enforcement used in early America may seem distant and archaic, yet they resonate deeply with contemporary debates about policing, community safety, and justice reform. Examining these historical practices offers valuable insights into ongoing challenges and potential pathways forward. One of the most striking parallels is the concept of community involvement in public safety. Today, neighborhood watch programs, community policing initiatives, and citizen patrol groups echo the town watch system of colonial America. These modern programs aim to foster collaboration between residents and law enforcement, empowering communities to take an active role in preventing crime. However, as history shows, such systems are vulnerable to the same pitfalls: inconsistent participation, lack of training, and the risk of vigilantism. The debate over vigilante justice also persists. In recent years, incidents of citizens taking law enforcement into their own hands, whether through armed neighborhood patrols or online justice warriors exposing alleged wrongdoers, have sparked controversy. The regulator movement of the 1760s reminds us that while community-led enforcement can fill gaps left by inadequate formal systems, it also risks devolving into mob rule, where accusations replace due process and vengeance replaces justice. The historical reliance on public punishment and shame has modern counterparts in the phenomenon of cancel culture and online shaming. Social media has created new forms of public spectacle where individuals are called out, condemned, and punished by the court of public opinion. While some argue this holds powerful people accountable, others warn of the dangers of mob mentality, lack of due process, and disproportionate punishment, concerns that mirror those of colonial-era public punishments. The legacy of slave patrols is perhaps the most urgent and troubling connection to the present. Scholars and activists have traced direct lines from slave patrols to the development of police forces in the South, highlighting how systems designed to control and oppress Black communities evolved into modern policing practices. This history fuels contemporary demands for police reform and abolition, as communities grapple with the question: can institutions rooted in such injustice be reformed, or must they be reimagined entirely? Finally, the early American experience underscores the importance of balancing community involvement with professional accountability. While citizens should play a role in maintaining safety, history shows that effective, fair justice requires trained professionals, legal oversight, and robust protections for individual rights. The challenge today is to build systems that honor the communal spirit of early America while avoiding its failures, systems that are inclusive, accountable, and just. Early American towns faced the daunting task of maintaining order without the infrastructure, resources, or professional law enforcement we take for granted today. Through town watches, constables, community patrols, and, unfortunately, vigilante justice and slave patrols, they created systems that were inventive, flawed, and deeply human. These systems reflected the values, fears, and hierarchies of their time, offering both protection and oppression, justice and injustice. As we look back on this history, we're reminded that law enforcement is not a static institution handed down from on high. It's a constantly evolving response to the needs, challenges, and values of society. The early American experience shows us the power of community involvement, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the critical importance of fairness and accountability. Today, as we debate the future of policing in America, we might ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn from our ancestors? How can we build systems that protect without oppressing, that involve communities without descending into mob rule, that balance accountability with compassion? History doesn't offer easy answers, but it does offer perspective. The struggles of early Americans to create just, effective systems of law enforcement are not so different from our own. Perhaps by understanding where we've been, we can better navigate where we're going. What do you think? Could community-based systems like those in early America work today, or do we need something entirely different? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into American history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next historical exploration. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep history alive.